Have you ever felt like the whole world has moved on while you've been stuck in time? It was Veterans Day. The sun had barely risen when he started walking. A 98-year-old man. Fragile body, slow steps, but with a determination that seemed to disobey his age. On the sidewalk still damp from the early morning dew, the sound of the cane hitting the ground was the only sign that anyone was crossing those empty streets. Homes were closed, businesses were dormant, and the cold wind danced with the flap of the old military beret he had worn every year on the same day for decades. But there was something different that morning. That wasn't just another date on the calendar. Not for him, and not for what he carried hidden in the inside pocket of his coat, close to his chest. A piece of the past, a wound open 80 years ago. And perhaps only now it would begin to heal. He moved on, as if carrying out a silent ritual. Every step an effort. Every look at the street is a memory. That city had changed so much. The stores, the faces, the sounds. Everything seemed more hurried, colder. Nobody there knew who he was. Nobody imagined what that old man carried inside him. But he knew. And that was enough. When he arrived at the main square, he saw the old wooden bench where he always sat to watch the parade. No one ever stopped him from occupying that space. It was as if the bench had been made for him, or perhaps shaped by him, with the weight of the years and memories that rested there. He sat down with difficulty. He took a deep breath, and then he closed his eyes. For an instant, everything disappeared. The cold, the silence, the loneliness. He could hear the boots in the mud again, the gunshots in the distance, the muffled sound of voices in another language. And, above all, his brother's laugh, the last he heard before the war separated them forever. That laugh still echoed, like a cruel whisper of fate, because the brother is gone. But the letter stayed. A letter never delivered. A goodbye that went unheard for decades. Maybe you've never met someone like this. Someone who survived the war, but never fully came back from it. Someone who carries on their chest not a medal, but a promise. And if you've made it this far, perhaps it's because you also feel that there are stories that time cannot bury, that there are voices that still need to be heard. Stay with me, because what will happen in this square, in front of a crowd that has no idea what they are about to hear, could mark you forever. And what is this veteran about to do? It will prove that the legacy of a brother in arms never dies. And it all starts when a young cadet decides to get closer. The young cadet stood out among the others, not because of his impeccable uniform or his upright posture, but because of the attention he paid to what many ignored. As he passed through the square, something made him stop. Maybe it was the silence around that old man, or maybe it was his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if he saw something that no one else saw. He hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and approached. "Did you serve?" he asked, with a low voice, almost as if asking permission to enter a sacred story. The old man did not respond immediately. He just slowly turned his face, and his eyes, red, moist, full of the past, met the boy's. With trembling fingers, he reached into his coat's inner pocket. The same coat that had accompanied him for over 50 years. And from there, he took an aged, yellowed paper, with marks of time and the sweat of internal battles that never stopped. He gave me this," he whispered, almost voiceless, before disappearing. The young man took the letter carefully, as if he had something more fragile than paper in his hands. A piece of soul. Read the first lines. It locked. His chest tightened. It was a farewell. But it was also a cry for justice, for memory, for a voice. Meanwhile, the old man looked back at the avenue. Children waved flags. The drums beat. The city was celebrating, but it still didn't know what it was about to hear. And you? Have you ever felt like something inside you needed to be said, but no one was listening? Have you ever come across someone who seemed invisible, until a story made you see them with different eyes? If this topic makes sense to you, if this scene touched you in some way, I invite you to leave in the comments what you felt so far. Sometimes a simple comment can open space for other people to also get emotional, reflect, or even heal. Like this video if it reminds you of someone. A grandfather, an uncle, a neighbor that everyone forgot, because every like helps this story go further, to reach those who need to hear it. And if you believe, like me, that the past cannot be buried in silence, that there are legacies that still need to be honored, subscribe here to the channel. It is with your presence that this space continues to exist. It is with you that these stories come to life again. Because deep down, we all carry an undelivered letter. And sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to listen. At that moment, the cadet stood up with determination. He knew what he needed to do, and nothing would be the same again. He no longer remembered his face clearly. Time had taken away details that previously seemed eternal. The outline of his brother's eyes, the exact timbre of his voice, even the way he laughed when he pretended not to be afraid. But the pain, it never went away. It was a constant presence, like a shadow that had followed him since that day, the day he lost him forever. They were just boys when they embarked into the unknown. Two brothers, two uniforms, one hope to return together. But war doesn't care about promises. She chooses what she takes, what she destroys, and what she leaves behind. And in that muddy field in Europe, as planes crossed the sky and the smell of gunpowder dominated the air, something broke in a way that never came back. It was an ambush, fast, cruel, silent. The brother was called to a mission that everyone knew was suicidal. Nobody had the courage to stop him. He went and never came back. In return, he left a sealed letter in the eldest's hands. A letter that was supposed to be delivered to his family if he didn't return. But how can you give someone what you yourself refuse to accept? The letter stayed with him. First for a month, then a year, then a whole life. He went through wars and peace. It went through birthdays, funerals, weddings, survived falls, changes, storms, emotional fires. It was never opened by anyone other than him. And yet, he never had the courage to read it out loud. It was as if every word was a knife. As if each line revealed something the world would never understand. The guilt wouldn't leave him. Not because I survived, but because I didn't do more. For not screaming. For not stopping it. For not having died together. That was the weight. Not from the letter, but from the silence. A silence that prevented him from sleeping completely, from laughing completely, from living in peace. For decades, he walked this road without telling anyone. He wore the coat in every parade, as if it were armor against oblivion. Always with the letter in your pocket, protected, intact. Every time he sat on that bench, he looked up at the sky and imagined his brother next to him. Sometimes he spoke in a low voice. Sometimes I just cried. But it never stopped being there. It was his way of keeping his promise alive, even if the world had already forgotten. The city didn't know. People passed by, laughed, celebrated. Nobody noticed the old man with his eyes lost in time. No one understood that that man with slow steps carried, in his chest, the last breath of someone who gave his life to protect them all. And yet, even though ignored, he came back. Every year. With the same clothes, the same silence, the same broken heart. Some pains don't scream. They just stay. They breathe with you. They grow old with you. And when the body no longer responds, it is in them that you still feel like you were alive. And you know what hurts most? It's not the memory. It's the fear that one day no one will remember. Write it in the comments. That memory still lives on. Because sometimes all a story needs is someone willing to remember. At that moment, as the cadet held the letter in his hands, a lump formed in his throat. He felt the weight of it, the value, the urgency. And then he looked into the veteran's eyes and knew exactly what he needed to do. Without saying anything, he stood up and he walked towards the crowd. The drums started to sound, rhythmic, strong, almost rehearsed to erase the silence that preceded the parade. Children waved flags with big smiles. Parents filmed everything with cell phones in hand. Teenagers joked at the back of the square. It was a day of celebration, a civic spectacle, a public tribute. But for him, sitting there on the bench that seemed increasingly cold, it was something else. It was a living funeral. The old man remained with his eyes fixed on the asphalt, not because he cared about the military cars or the school bands, but because there, on that same stretch of street, he had already seen his brother march in silence, even when the rest of the world couldn't see. It was there that, year after year, he tried to find in the face of a young person the sparkle that was in the eyes of someone who left and never returned, never found it. Nobody recognized him. The authorities passed just a few meters away from him and didn't even wave. Nothing. As if it were part of the landscape. As if it didn't exist. The beret, the worn insignia on the chest, the old coat. Everything was invisible now. He was just an old man bent with age, with downcast eyes and heavy shoulders. The only thing that still made him lift his head was the sound of some hymn played in the distance. Because in those sounds there were ghosts. And even then, he didn't expect tributes, not even for applause. He learned long ago that the deepest wounds don't shine in public, that true courage does not require the spotlight, and that there are pains that are only shared with the wind. But there was a void that was difficult to ignore, a constant feeling of displacement, as if the world had moved forward without looking back, as if the sacrifice had been made in vain. What he once defended with his body and soul was now just a cold memory in history books, or worse, a date to sell paper flags and themed t-shirts. The letter was still there, kept close to his heart. That shaky handwriting of his brother, written with hands dirty with clay and blood, was perhaps the only proof that all that really happened. Because, looking around, it was easy to doubt. It was easy to think that the war had been just an old nightmare from which he never woken up. But the pain was real. The absence was real. And the silence. The silence was unbearably real. The crowd cheered as younger veterans paraded in decorated trucks. They smiled, waved, received flowers. He remained motionless, not out of envy, ever, but because he felt like a forgotten page in a book that no one leafed through anymore. The type of story that scares, that bothers, that moves. And that is why it is left aside. How many heroes pass by our side without us knowing the weight they carry? How many times do we pass by scarred faces without imagining the battles fought behind every wrinkle, every tired look, every shuffling step? His pain wasn't just for his brother. It was about time, for neglect, for everything that was given and never returned, for the youth left on the battlefields, for the hug that never came, for the letter that never arrived, and for the bitter certainty that, perhaps, everything had been in vain. But that morning, there was something in the air, something different, a subtle change in the rhythm of life, as if, in some inexplicable way, that silence was about to be broken. That young cadet was still nearby. The old man noticed his restless look, his rapid breathing, his eyes that kept returning to him. As if that boy, without knowing exactly why, sensed that there was something big hidden in that threadbare coat. And when the sound of the parade seemed to fade away for a few minutes, as if the world had turned down the volume just so they could hear each other better, it was at that moment that the old man's eyes met the cadet's eyes again. And, without saying anything, he nodded with an almost imperceptible movement, a small gesture, but loaded with immense meaning. The boy understood. And his face changed. There, on that bench worn by time and memories, something had been transferred. Something that cannot be written, cannot be photographed, cannot be explained. Something that only those who carry an unfulfilled promise can feel. Maybe you've never stopped to think about it, but often the greatest gestures happen in silence. They don't need a stage. They just need courage. And when the cadet took the first step towards the stage, carrying that letter in hand, a silent transformation began to happen. Not just in the square, but in the entire meaning of that day. Write it in the comments. I saw this silence. Because whoever sees the invisible also helps to heal what no one sees. And speaking of courage, there is something that still needs to be revealed. A truth that was hidden for a long time. And now, finally, it is beginning to find a voice. The question came out timidly, almost childishly, as if the cadet was afraid of disturbing an ancient spirit. "Did you serve?" he said with wide eyes, not knowing that that sentence would open a door that had been locked for almost 8 decades. The old man remained silent for a few seconds. He didn't look away. He didn't smile. He just moved one of his hands with effort to his chest, slowly opened his worn coat, and pulled out what seemed like a piece of his own soul, the letter. The paper was yellowed, with dry edges, a deep crease marking its central fold. It was as if time had bitten into every corner of her, but without being able to erase her essence. He handed the letter to the cadet with trembling fingers. "This letter is from a brother who never returned," he murmured, his voice caught between pride and guilt. The boy held the envelope delicately, as if handling a sacred relic. When he touched that paper, he felt something strange. A chill down his spine, a pressure in his chest, a silence between his heart and reason. And when his eyes fell to the shaky handwriting, something inside him collapsed. He started reading. 2 lines, 3, and then it stopped. I couldn't do it anymore. The weight of the words was greater than his ability to maintain his composure. It was a request for forgiveness. It was a testament of love. It was a cry for dignity coming from a battlefield forgotten by the rush of the world. The cadet blinked rapidly, as if trying to hide tears with pride, but it failed. And the old man just watched him, as if he were finally seeing someone hear that for the first time. With the respect she deserved. The cadet took a deep breath, clutched the envelope to his chest, and said softly, "This needs to be heard." And at that moment, something that no one noticed happened. Responsibility has changed hands. The letter stopped being a kept secret and became a shared mission. He got up. The crowd was still applauding from afar. The musicians were still marching. The event announcer was announcing the next honorees. But none of that mattered anymore. The cadet walked determinedly towards the organization tent, passing through smiling faces, hurried steps, and indifferent voices. He was about to interrupt a protocol, but it wasn't about protocol. It was about truth, about memory, about doing what needed to be done, even if no one else understood. Inside the tent, the organizers looked at him strangely. He quickly explained, his voice still breaking, that he had found a veteran carrying a letter written by his missing brother in 1944. And that this letter needed to be read in public. I needed to be heard, now. The first reaction was hesitation. An off-schedule reading, in the middle of the parade, could disrupt the entire sequence. But all he had to do was show the envelope. All it took was for one of the organizers to open it and see the first words written in almost faded ink. If this letter is being read, it's because I didn't come back. So that the climate would change. Everyone there understood, almost silently, that they were facing something bigger. Something that went beyond the event, the medals, the ready-made speeches. It was living history knocking on the door. And refusing would be like locking down the heart of the city once again. Decisions like this are not easy. They require courage. They require breaking the routine to make room for transformation. And perhaps that's why that parade, which until then followed a standard script, took a break. Because at that moment, the most important thing was not the sequence. It was the hidden truth that was about to come to light. The letter was delivered to the master of ceremonies. The sound of instruments stopped. People began to look around, confused. An announcement was made over the loudspeaker, asking for silence. Before we go any further, we have something very special to share. Something that has been kept for almost 80 years. A letter written by a young soldier in the midst of war and which has finally found the chance to be read. Today, here, in front of you all. The ambient sound disappeared. The world seemed to turn down the volume just to hear what came next. And there, in that pause full of meaning, the old man, still sitting on the bench, lowered his head. not out of weakness, but out of reverence. It was as if, finally, time had stopped to listen to what he had been trying to say for a lifetime. In the letter, the brother talked about his fears before the mission. He told about the cold in his soul, about the men at his side who already knew they wouldn't return. He apologized to the family. He said that if something happened, he wanted them to know that he fought with honor, that he didn't regret, that I wasn't alone, that his older brother was his greatest example, and that, if I died, I would like these words to be read one day. So the city would know. So the world would know. As the text was read aloud, there was a moment when no one could take a deep breath. People cried without really understanding why. Children fell silent as if something sacred was happening. And the eyes returned to the bench, for the old man, which was now shaking, but not from the cold. It was something else. It was as if, finally, that guilt of a lifetime was starting to come out, as if the weight on his shoulders dissipated with each word spoken. Because he never managed to keep his promise. He never managed to deliver the letter to his mother, who died without knowing it. She never told her father, who spent the rest of his life waiting for his son to return. You've never read to anyone. But now, she was there, alive, and his brother too, through words, from the broken silence. Justice done with the power of a voice shaking into the microphone. Write it in the comments. I would have read that letter too. Because sometimes all that someone needs is for someone to be willing to listen. And the most impressive thing was yet to happen. Because when the last words of the letter were spoken, something changed in the air. A different energy took over the square, as if that moment had awakened something dormant within everyone. And that's exactly where the true journey begins to take on another meaning. The last line of the letter echoed like subdued thunder. If I don't come back, tell everyone that I fought alongside my brother, and that it was the greatest honor of my life. And then, silence. A dense, charged, almost suffocating silence, as if all the voices in the square had been ripped away at once. Nobody knew what to say. No one knew if they could say anything. Because there, faced with that raw truth, there was no room for shallow comments, polite smiles, or formal applause. The pain remained in the air, invisible but present. A collective mourning took over the entire city, not for someone who died today, but for someone who died 80 years ago, and who was only now, in fact, being buried with honor. There were mothers hugging their children, grown men crying without embarrassment, young people in absolute silence, as if they had, for the first time, understood what it means to give your life for something bigger than yourself. And in the middle of it all, the old man was still there, sitting, hard, the gaze stuck somewhere between the past and the now. He didn't cry, don't smile. But he was shaking. What was happening inside was beyond tears. It was a violent mixture of relief and pain, of gratitude and repentance. He was being freed, and at the same time, emptied. Like someone who finally leaves a weight on the floor after carrying it for so long that they no longer know what it's like to walk without it. And it's in those kinds of moments that you realize the true impact of an untold story. How many truths are buried under the rush of the modern world? How many voices have been ignored because they seemed too old, too slow, too uncomfortable for today's hurried ears? How many times do we come across heroes dressed in old age and don't even stop to look? That parade, which began as just another calendar event, became a kind of reconciliation ceremony. Not just between a veteran and his past, but between an entire city and its memory. It was as if every word in the letter had broken through a layer of oblivion, a layer of coldness, a layer of indifference. And the most impressive thing is that no one there needed to be from the same family to feel what was happening. Because what was read that morning spoke of what we all carry somewhere hidden, the fear of being forgotten, the desire that our story was worth it, the hope that, after all, someone understands us. A middle-aged man, leaning on a cane, approached the old man on the bench. He took off his cap as a sign of respect and stood there without saying anything. Others came. a woman holding her little son's hand, a younger veteran, his uniform still clean, a boy in a scout uniform. Nobody said a word. But the looks said it all. They weren't there to console, not even to pay homage. They were there because they had been touched, because something inside them had been transformed. And the old man, with his hands folded in his lap, looked at each one with moist eyes. For the first time, he was not alone. For the first time, that bench wasn't an exile. It was an altar. And the most unexpected thing happened. One of the organizers, visibly moved, took the microphone and asked everyone to stand. He asked for a minute of silence. But this minute was not like the others. He was charged with an energy that words cannot describe. The kind of silence that screams, "How clean! What a cure!" At the end of that minute, no one was back to normal. The city, somehow, had changed. The parade would continue, but not like before. Not with the same eyes. Not in the same hurry. There was now a living consciousness pulsing among the people. An invisible presence, but one that gave weight to each step, each gesture. And it was in this new climate that something even greater began to be born. The cadet returned to the bank. He knelt down next to the veteran and returned the letter. But the old man, in a low voice, said, "Now it no longer belongs to me." And with that simple gesture, he passed on the greatest legacy he has ever had. Comment there. Pain also teaches. Because not all suffering is just wounds. Sometimes it's the most honest path to the truth. And as discreet applause echoed in the background, a plan began to form. A spontaneous movement, but full of purpose. Something was about to emerge from that letter. A more lasting tribute. A way to ensure that silence would never again take the place of memory. That night, the sky was especially silent. There was no wind, there was no rain, there were no typical small-town noises. It was as if the entire time had stopped on purpose, as if everything around knew that something sacred was about to happen. The old man went to bed early. The legs, punished by so many years of battle, physical and emotional, finally gave way. But his face was at peace. For the first time in many decades, he weightlessly closed his eyes. No anguish, no pending issues. He was still wearing his coat, the same one who carried the letter for so many years. And the letter was still there, now without the obligation to be read, but with a new meaning. No longer a guilt, but a symbol. An anchor of love, sacrifice and honor that had finally found its place in the world. The next morning, when the neighbors noticed that he didn't appear on the porch as usual, they decided to knock on the door. It was the cadet himself, the same young man who had read the letter, who entered first. And what he saw there was not a sad end. It was a worthy end to a journey that deserved respect. The old man was lying down, his body serene, his fingers intertwined on his chest, holding the letter, as if it were the last connection between this world and the next. The news spread quickly, but unlike so many other stories that die as soon as they make headlines, this one spread with a different tone. There was not just mourning, there was recognition, there was transformation. Something profound had been awakened throughout the city. For years, that man was just a forgotten face in the crowd. A bent body, a cane, an uncomfortable silence. Now it was a name. It was voice. It was history. And what he left behind wasn't just an emotional legacy. It was action. A few days later, the city hall announced the construction of a memorial. Simple, without exaggeration, but with everything that mattered. A wooden bench, an exact replica of the one he used in the parade, flanked by 2 plaques. In one, the name of the veteran. On the other, the name of the brother lost in combat. And in the center, an inscription that left no doubt about the strength of that gesture. Here, memory overcame silence. People started visiting the place, first out of curiosity, then out of necessity. It was as if that space had become a kind of invisible confessional. Some left flowers, others letters. There were those who sat there just to breathe and remember someone they loved. Because there, on that bench, everyone understood. Not every war ends with the end of the fight. Some remain inside us until someone has the courage to listen. The young cadet returned there many times. He sat on the bench with his uniform impeccable, his eyes steady, and his chest inflated with a new responsibility. He didn't inherit a letter. He inherited a purpose. And in that purpose, he rediscovered the true meaning of everything he had learned in his military training: respect, loyalty, sacrifice. But now he understood that none of this had any value if it wasn't applied in everyday life, if it weren't lived truthfully and not just memorized in oaths. He was the one who started a movement that no one expected. He brought together colleagues, friends, younger veterans, and proposed something bold: a program of living stories. The idea was simple but powerful. Give voice to forgotten veterans, record their stories, their pain, their victories. Because it's not just blood that builds a country's history. It's the words, the testimonies, the scars revealed behind the scenes. And it is impressive how a single letter, kept for so long in the pocket of a lonely man, managed to provoke such a revolution in mentality. Local schools began to study that history. Teachers used the case as an example of perseverance and hidden truth. Psychologists cited the episode as a form of collective treatment of unresolved grief. And that bench became a place of healing. It's funny to think how life acts sometimes. The old man died in silence, the same way he lived his last years. But what was left behind was noise. Good noise. Noise from living memory. Of real change. From people waking up to things that had been dormant for a long time. And this is one of the greatest revelations of the human journey. No one truly leaves until there is someone who decides to remember with love. The legacy is not in medals, in records, in formal speeches. The legacy is in the impact that one life has when it connects with another. And on that Veterans Day, an entire city learned that true tribute is not done with fireworks or parades, but with listening, with presence, with the courage to say, "I see you." Or write it in the comments. May my story also find ears. Because somewhere, someone needs to hear what you still have in your chest. And if you feel like this story isn't over yet, you're right. Because what started with a lost letter now inspires letters that haven't even been written yet. And there is one last detail. Something that no one expected, and that forever changed the fate of those who heard this story. If you've made it this far, maybe this story has stirred something inside you. And if it touched your heart in some way, it's because, deep down, we all carry our own silent letters, waiting for the right moment to be opened, or heard. If this type of story makes sense to you, if these memories, pains, and transformations also resonate with your journey, subscribe to the channel here. This is where we continue to give voice to what the world often forgets. And believe me, there is a lot of story that still needs to be told, and you are part of it. Leave a like if this connection was real for you. This helps this content reach more people who, like us, still believe that respect, memory, and truth matter. And before leaving, write in the comments, "This story goes with me." So I know that you stayed until the end, and that the message found a home. There's a video here that complements everything we experienced today. Click and stay with me there, because some stories can't stop halfway.